If you have ever felt that the amount you need from the people close to you is too much, that your hunger for reassurance, for contact, for the felt certainty that you are loved and that they are not going anywhere, is more intense than what other people seem to need, or more than what the people around you can comfortably provide, you already know what it costs to carry that hunger without understanding it. The shame that accumulates around needing too much is one of the quietest forms of suffering, because it doesn't announce itself as pain. It arrives as a verdict about what you are: too sensitive, too dependent, too demanding, fundamentally difficult to love in the way you most need to be loved. And the verdict feels like evidence rather than judgment, because it is confirmed repeatedly in the exact moments when the need is most visible and the response is insufficient. What that verdict misses entirely is the architecture that produced the need. The intensity of your longing for closeness did not arrive from nowhere. It was built carefully and systematically by the specific pattern of experiences you had with the people who were supposed to be safe, the early caregivers whose responses to your distress, your need, your vulnerability, taught your developing nervous system something foundational about what to expect when you reach toward another person. That lesson is still running. It shapes every subsequent reaching, and until it is understood at that level of specificity, it cannot be addressed at that level of specificity. It can only be managed, which is different, and which produces a much lower quality of life. John Bowlby's attachment theory, developed across decades of clinical and empirical work, beginning in the 1950s and extending through the 1980s, established the foundational architecture for understanding this. Bowlby's central argument was that the bond between infant and caregiver is not primarily driven by feeding or comfort in the simple sense. It is driven by a biological system whose specific purpose is proximity to a protective other in the face of threat. The attachment system is a survival mechanism. When the infant is frightened, hurt, uncertain, or distressed, the attachment system activates and drives proximity-seeking behavior, crying, reaching, clinging, because proximity to a reliable caregiver is the most effective threat reduction available to an organism that cannot regulate itself. The felt sense of safety, what Bowlby called the secure base, is established through the caregiver's consistent, attuned, and effective responses to the infant's activation of the attachment system. The critical word in that sentence is consistent. What Bowlby demonstrated, and what subsequent decades of attachment research have confirmed with remarkable reliability, is that the security of the attachment is determined not primarily by the warmth or love of the caregiver in neutral moments, but by the reliability of the caregiver's response when the attachment system is activated. A caregiver who is consistently responsive, who shows up reliably when the child is distressed, who provides comfort that actually regulates the distress, and who allows the child to return to exploration with the security that support will be available if needed, builds what Bowlby called secure attachment. The child learns that the attachment system activation will be met with an effective response, and this learning does something specific. It downregulates the system's sensitivity. When you reliably get what you need when you reach for it, the reaching can be appropriately calibrated, not absent, because the system never fully deactivates, but not hyperactivated either, because the evidence of reliability has been accumulated. The contrasting pattern, the one that produces the hunger you may recognize, is what attachment researchers call anxious or preoccupied attachment, and it develops specifically in response to caregiving that is inconsistent, present and responsive in some moments, absent, distracted, or misattuned in others, without any reliable pattern that the child can use to predict what will happen when the system activates. The child in this environment learns something profoundly consequential. The caregiver is available, but not reliably so, and the connection must be actively maintained through intensified attachment behavior, because allowing it to lapse may result in loss of access to the only source of comfort available. The attachment system's sensitivity is upregulated rather than downregulated. The hunger becomes more intense, not less, because intensity has been the adaptive response, the strategy that maximized the probability of receiving comfort in an environment where comfort was inconsistently available. This is not neediness as a character trait. It is neediness as a learned strategy, shaped by a specific history of intermittent reinforcement and maintained because the underlying need for the security that consistent responsiveness would have provided was never adequately met. Sue Johnson, whose work developing emotionally focused therapy represents one of the most empirically validated approaches to adult attachment and relationship distress, extended Bowlby's framework into the context of adult romantic relationships with findings that are clarifying, precisely because they honor the depth and seriousness of what adult attachment involves. Johnson's clinical observation, confirmed in thousands of couples, is that what looks like conflict in close relationships is almost invariably an attachment struggle, a cycle in which one partner's intensified attachment behavior, the reaching, the demanding, the protest at perceived withdrawal, triggers the other partner's deactivating response, which in turn intensifies the first partner's reaching, which triggers more deactivation. Both are acting from their attachment systems. Both are convinced they are responding to the other's behavior. Neither can see, without help, that they are each responding to the thing they most fear. For the anxiously attached partner, the fear of abandonment and loss of connection. For the more avoidant partner, the fear of overwhelm and loss of self. And that the dance they are doing together is maintaining exactly the dynamic it is trying to escape. Johnson's framework makes an observation that is therapeutically essential. The intensity of the reaching is proportional to the depth of the need, and the depth of the need is proportional to the degree to which the foundational experience of secure connection was absent. The person who is most accused of needing too much is often the person who needed the most, not as a pathological excess, but as an unmet developmental requirement. The hunger is not evidence of dysfunction, it is evidence of deprivation, and the distinction matters enormously for how the person relates to the hunger and how their partners relate to it. Understanding that you are hungry because you were not adequately fed is different from understanding that you are hungry because something is wrong with your appetite. Esther Perel's contribution to this framework comes from her attention to the specific tension that anxious attachment creates in the context of adult intimacy, the tension between the need for closeness and the fear that closeness will expose the depth of the need in ways that will drive the loved person away. Perel identifies a particular suffering that is specific to the anxiously attached person in an adult relationship, the person who wants nothing more than genuine intimacy, but whose reaching for it is so urgent, so monitoring, so vigilant for signs of withdrawal, that it creates the very distance it is trying to prevent. The intimacy need and the intimacy-seeking behavior are working at cross purposes. The behavior that emerges from the fear of loss, the checking, the reassurance seeking, the protest, the pursuit, is exactly the behavior most likely to produce the experience of the partner as overwhelmed and retreating, and the retreat confirms the fear, which intensifies the reaching, which produces more retreat. Perel calls this the protest cycle, and its tragedy is that it is driven entirely by love, by the depth and reality of the attachment, expressed through a behavioral strategy that was adaptive in childhood and is catastrophically counterproductive in adult relationships. The practical work that emerges from this framework is not the elimination of the attachment need. That need is healthy, appropriate to an adult in close relationship, and its expression is one of the things that makes intimate relationships genuinely nourishing. The work is the development of what Bowlby called earned security, the gradual accumulation of experiences in therapy, in relationships where the attachment need is met consistently enough, in the internal relationship with oneself, that begin to update the underlying working model. The working model is the implicit set of expectations about what will happen when the attachment system activates, built through early experience and maintained, because it is the framework through which all subsequent attachment experiences are interpreted. Updating it requires experiences that genuinely contradict its predictions, experiences in which reaching produces connection rather than withdrawal, in which need is met rather than shamed, in which the loved person remains present and reliable rather than inconsistently available. Johnson's therapeutic work provides the specific relational technology for this, helping partners understand each other's attachment dances well enough that the partner of the anxiously attached person can recognize the reaching as a bid for connection rather than a demand, and can respond with presence rather than deactivation. When this happens, when the anxiously attached person reaches and is met reliably with a tuned presence, something in the nervous system begins to update. Not immediately, not from a single experience, but with sufficient repetition, the system's sensitivity begins to calibrate downward because the evidence of reliability is beginning to accumulate. The hunger does not disappear, but it becomes less desperate, because desperation was always a function of scarcity, not of appetite. The thing worth naming directly, because it is the thing most likely to be lost under the weight of the self-critical verdict. You are not too much. You are a person whose attachment system learned, in an environment that did not consistently provide what it needed, to reach with intensity. That intensity is not evidence of pathology, it is evidence of a normal human need that was imperfectly met in a formative context. And it is maintained by a working model that was built for that context, not for this one. Updating the model is possible. The reaching, understood rather than shamed, becomes something different, not desperation, but a genuine signal about what you need and what genuine connection looks like for you. And that signal, read clearly, is one of the most direct paths toward relationships that can actually provide what the hunger has always been reaching for. The next thread worth following is how the brain is wired for other people, specifically the neuroscience of social connection, and why human well-being is so fundamentally and irreducibly social. That is the next layer. For now, in the relationships where you feel safest, what does the other person do that makes the reaching feel less urgent? And in the relationships where the hunger feels most intense, what is it specifically that is absent? Those two questions point in the same direction. Leave whatever comes to mind in the comments. And if this channel is where you build understanding that makes your closest relationships more navigable, the subscribe button is for that work. Share it with someone whose reaching you've witnessed and whose hunger you now understand differently.